So just to give you a quick introduction into who we have got with us today, we have the Reverend Chris Lee, who's the vicar of St Saviour's Church in West London, with a following of 176,000 on Instagram, which is double that of the Church of England. And he's just written a book called The OMG Effect, which is, I think, 60-second sermons. We have Miranda Threlfall-Holmes, who is a blogger and vicar of St Luke's in the city, Liverpool. Salim Kassam, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Muslim Vibe. Reverend Dr. Peter Phillips, who looks at digital theology and director of Research Centre on Digital Theology at University of Durham. And we've also got the young imam, who I believe was mentored by Reverend Chris Lee. So we're really happy to have you all here. The young imam, sorry, I should say, is Sabah Ahmedi, who is also with us. So I'm going to start with Chris, if I can, Chris Lee. Can you just tell us how you built your audiences and what you think the pandemic has taught the Church of England when it comes to digital engagement?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me. And hello, everyone. And it's great to be part of this discussion. My Instagram an online platform grew initially because I was involved in a YouTube channel that became very popular. And I was asked to do kind of culture reacts to things. So to give my opinion on the stuff that, you know, young people watch online. So YouTube videos of music videos and common culture that we find ourselves in today. So I was asked by this YouTube channel to come on and discuss my feelings on Ariana Grande's God is a Woman video, or Billie Eilish's new music video, or BTS, which is a big Korean kind of pop band, and give my opinion. And I just started discussing these kind of normal cultural things for young people and what they're involved in. And I came across, I suppose, in a non-judgmental way, but giving some kind of spiritual flavor, some Christian insight in a way that I think people were able to engage with and found interesting. And I wasn't kind of detached and judgmental and sometimes what the church can be perceived as. And certainly sometimes the media loves to push us in that way and we become defensive as a church. But I was, I suppose, able to communicate humbly, confidently, the love of God and involving this kind of culture of the times. And that led to my Instagram account filling up because people searched me out online. And then that led me to understand that I had this opportunity to speak life and love and light into a very, what can be seen as often a superficial kind of, you know, the algorithms of me, myself, and I, and turning people into users on social media. So I was able to, in a sense, speak hope, life, light into this context, and people ate it up. Lots of young people were hungry for it. They enjoyed the way I was able to articulate faith. They wanted to listen to my insights on things, and I came up with this notion of 60-second sermons. It wasn't a big strategy, if I'm honest. It wasn't something that I was thinking, right, how do I reach everyone? It was just, I thought I have got, you know, Instagram in the early days only gave you 60 seconds. So I thought I've got 60 seconds to communicate something. Why don't I just call it 60-second sermons? And then as I was walking down the street or on the path, or on the road, if a thought came to me, I record a little thought and I shared those things. And this 60-second sermon kind of hit home with a lot of people, and my following increased. I have people of no faith who follow me, people of different Christian traditions that follow me, and people of other faiths that follow me as well. And it's been this kind of wild ride of communicating this message of hope into this superficial, often seen as superficial platform. So that is how my Instagram grew. And then I got some notoriety through the BBC and Good Morning Britain, and called me like their local vicar, and threw around things like the internet's priest and stuff like that. And that just increased this online following. And so yeah, that's how my following grew and how I developed it. And I now see my online presence as a part of my ministry as a priest. It used to be in the old days that it was something I did on the side, and it was this fun like addition to my priestly role, but now I definitely see it as part of my calling, in a sense, to be this presence online and speaking to young people around the world. So yeah, that was part of your first question.
And what are the lessons, do you think, of the pandemic for the church, and your own experience when it comes to digital?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the pandemic has thrown us all into the technological age. Certainly the Church of England isn't known for being massively tech advanced. There is a wonderful digital team in the Church of England, and I think they were started in 2016, and they've grown since then. But you know, when the first lockdown hit and churches were closed and worship had to move online, a lot of thinking suddenly went into, whoa, what's going on here? How do we even think about this? How do we do this well? And my Instagram's filled up by 50,000 plus during the first lockdown. So a lot of people were searching and looking. And I think we're being stretched at the moment. You know, there's, in any kind of big, almost like a wartime time. I'm not saying it is wartime at all, but there is similarities to the fact that we are all vulnerable. We all feel the vulnerability. We're all suffering, and we're distant. And it feels like we're in this massive big thing that's going on in the world. And that has caused some thinking in the church that you only get when you're under huge pressure, like a wartime time, where you're in this kind of cauldron of what are we going to do now, and everyone is thinking. And so there's been a lot of thinking about what it means to be embodied. You know, what does embodiment mean as a church online? How do we understand our theology of sacrament online? How do we adequately lead worship, as in musical or more contemplative, online? So there's been a lot going on, and I think some really good thinking about how we how we look to the future, because, you know, the technological revolution is here to stay. It's moving fast paced. The church needs to be involved in this. We need to be asking ourselves these questions. And I know there is some thinking about, for instance, doing Eucharists online. Richard Burridge, who wrote 4 Gospels, 1 Jesus, has been doing some theological thinking about what it means for the priest to pronounce blessing on sacraments and the role of the priest in that, even online. And that's been interesting and stretching. And you know, a lot, the church in a sense is having to grapple with new forms of church. Like what does it look like to be the body of Christ in a digital age? And there is other things I can say on that, like the idea of club and classroom as an inherited model from the church. So the church traditionally has been these 2 forms, club and classroom, in that you come to a building and you do events together like a club, and you spend time with each other, and classroom in that you come to a church building and you're taught by someone in the front, and you listen to them, and sometimes they might tell you off and you try and behave, and then you go away and you put into practice what you've been taught. So we've had those 2 models of club and classroom, but the pandemic and this technological age is going, well, what is there any other models of church? And are we just accepting this as normal? And what does it look like to be embodied online, to have different communities and houses of people popping up all over the world? And so there's lots of stuff going on, and I think it's interesting.
There is also evidence that the churches and parishes that are engaging online on social media are actually also seeing growth in their churches. Is that something that you are also seeing? And is the plan to bring people physically into the church through the digital outreach?
I think it's a good question. I think obviously there is some worry and some criticism. Apparently during the first lockdown, there was a report done, I think The Guardian published an article about 1 in 4 people clicking into religious services online. And that is exciting, and that is showing that there's a hunger and a thirst out there. The criticism of that is, how much does that actually mean engagement? How long was someone online watching? But I still think that's a subcategory to the fact that people are searching. I think the exciting thing there is 1 in 4 people did choose to click into a service. And that is really good. That shows a hunger and a thirst for something more, something divine. So there is a search there. Sorry, Chris, I've lost the second part of that question.
Yeah, is the digital engagement about trying to bring people physically into the church?
Yeah, I think, you know, from certainly my platform, what I do is I encourage people to find a church near them. I don't promote my church, but I encourage people to find a church. Because community and person-to-person relationship is the thing that we ultimately want and need as human beings. Although there is greater thinking and understanding that needs to go on around what it looks like to have communities online. And as human beings, we search out community, we search out relationship. And the truth is, there is a lot of young people who are gaming online, who are spending, you know, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 hours online, and they are developing elements of relationship that I think even someone from my boomer generation doesn't understand, where they are battling in their games together. They're talking, they're sharing experience, and they're developing friendships online. And I think that is scary for many of us. We don't understand it. And I think there is this new age of young people who have, you know, real like kind of avatar personalities online, where they see themselves online as much as almost in real person. And there is some difficulty to that, and getting our heads around that, I think, is difficult. But you can gain community and relationship through online activity in ways that I think we're still discovering. But ultimately, I do believe that you should come back to being gathered as much as you can, to be in person-to-person relationship. I don't want to say, oh, all online is great, baby out with the bathwater. But I also want to challenge, you know, my thinking, and maybe some of us who don't quite understand what it is that communities are developing on, because there is something special there as well.
Now, I know that you mentored or advised, I should say, Saba Ahmedi, the young imam, who's also on the call.
Just to be clear, I never mentored him. He asked me a while back. We've been following each other on Instagram for a while. And I think a couple of years ago, he messaged me and said, hey, Chris, I love what you're doing. And it was really encouraging. And he asked for some advice. And I said, oh, this is some advice. And, you know, that is all that I've done. Yeah. I've in no way mentored.
No, sorry. It's interesting collaboration. So, but Saba, maybe you could tell us about your perspective and how things are happening. What's happening within the Muslim communities? And I'd also, after Saba's spoken, could I hear from Salim Kassam, who could also give us some insights? But Saba, please tell us what's happening.
Thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Saba Ahmedi. I'm one of Britain's youngest imams, and I'm currently working in the media as a young imam, offering the Muslim perspective on certain topics. I've not got a massive long white beard. I don't wear the long white robes. I'm not middle-aged. I've got banter. So that stereotypical image of an imam, which someone might have, totally gets shut down when they see my mugshot turn up for a coffee over a meeting talking about current affairs. So I'm currently working. This opportunity has come through serving as an imam in my community. I'm currently working also with the UN, working on policy making in regards to how to tackle violent extremism and how to engage the youth in healthy conversations and dialogue based around faith and inclusion, and accepting that, yeah, we might be different, we might have a different exterior, but internally we're all the same person. We're all based on love for humanity and kindness and sharing. My online presence started about a year and a half ago, and rightly so. I reached out to Chris and said, look, Chris, you're absolutely smashing on social media. How are you doing it? What is it? What's driving you? And what do you do which is so engaging? So I've been watching Chris, been a massive inspiration for me. And it's nice to see that faith leaders are using the social media world to engage people, especially the younger generation. That's where they all are, scrolling through TikTok, scrolling through Instagram. People's attention span is now not more than 20 seconds, hence why I've turned a lot towards Reels and TikToks, talking about Islam, educating people, and trying to create a platform for conversation and dialogue. and to allow people to ask questions about Islam, about faith, because I know that there's a lot of misconceptions out there. A third of Britons feel that Islam threatens the British way of life. So I, as a Muslim, have a responsibility to try and reach out and give people the opportunity to ask questions, and ask questions which they might think are not PC. But until we're able to have that honest conversation, unite on our commonalities, unite on what we have in common, only then can we move forward and really live in a united kingdom, a place where we accept each other, we're there to unite on our similarities. I think social media is the way forward. In regards to how the community and prayer has changed, is that the question?
Yes, yes.
For me, well, for Muslims all over the world, for all religious leaders, community or congregation is a massive part of faith. Praying together, having that sense of unity and feeling and love and hope together in one room praying, you can't take that away and have that same feeling virtually. It's very hard to replicate that sense of love. It can happen, but I mean, at the moment, the community is encouraging people to pray at home with their families in congregation. It's encouraging people to learn about their own faith and develop more understanding of what they believe in. Because as Muslims, we pray 5 times a day, and also having the Friday prayer, the Friday being the holiest day in the week for Muslims. So learning and how to deliver sermons at home has been a massive learning curve for people at home as well. So as well as that, obviously now the classes can't take place in the mosque physically, so now we're doing online classes, talking about religion, talking about faith, also like doing mentoring one-to-one with individuals, having workshops, which is not always talking about faith, but also talking about current affairs like alcohol, drug abuse, talking about current affairs which the youth are going through, even gaming addictions, which are really affecting people's mental health, how to deal with that and get a balance of faith and life, and stuff to do with secular education as well as religious education. So we're turning massively towards social media, Kahoot quizzes, video sessions, sermons and lectures online, obviously because we can't attend the mosque.
Can I just ask what your following is like now on social media? How many people have you got following your accounts, and what kind of reaction are you getting? Is it positive, or are you also experiencing trolls?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I started about a year ago. It's the first time I've ever been on Instagram, and I'm doing this solely as an imam to try and help people get through life, because I know they're looking for that rope of hope and faith and goodness and positivity. So before COVID, my numbers were in the hundreds, and by the grace of God, during COVID, my numbers are really shot up. So we're near 4,500 now. And I feel like one of the reasons for that is because, like I said, people are looking for that rope of hope. The word prayer was searched, or the word prayer was rocketed in Google search, according to Metro. A report came out last year. And like Rev Chris said, that people are looking for that sense of hope and positivity and goodness. And I think people have come to realize that some things are just out of our control, and we need to pray and take everyone on that spiritual journey, making sure everyone's got positive mental health and they're happy within themselves so that they're able to help other people. And I've been going live on a regular basis, just encouraging people to keep people afloat, because I've got a lot of messages in my DM saying I'm really struggling, I can't meet my friends and family. How do I stay happy and inculcate prayer in my daily life to help me get through the challenges which we all face day to day? So I've seen a massive number of people starting to follow me on social media, and it's been nice to receive messages of just goodness and messages of motivation. I've got people who follow me who are not Muslim, those people who are not even of faith. Friends from high school have messaged me recently saying, Saba, we just come across your page, and I'm not of faith, but I can see that energy which you put through your stories of goodness and just motivation. And that sometimes makes us think about life and even pray for a few seconds. And if we're able to achieve that collectively as a nation, instilling people with goodness and positivity and happiness at the end of the day, we're moving in the right direction of keeping people afloat.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And I'd like to ask Salim Kassam about how you see things, and were there people within the mosques and within your community who felt very upset that the places of worship had to close? Was there the same kind of debate that we saw within the churches, outrage that the buildings had to close in some quarters?
Yeah, so interestingly, thank you guys again for the opportunity to be here. It's a pleasure and fantastic panel of speakers. So I was actually a trustee of my local mosque during the pandemic when it first kicked off. We've had elections and I'm no longer involved. But I remember at the time we closed a couple of weeks before the government guidelines. Before the government enforced it, and there was uproar and there was outrage amongst community members, but we decided, and we had like a COVID task force that was set up that decided that it just wasn't safe. We have a community of over 5,000 in Northwest London, and we didn't want to take that risk. But interestingly, so we were lucky enough that at a community level we were able to adapt because we already had such a large community. We had online facilities, we had live streaming already for all of our programs. And whatever else. So, the month of Ramadan took place in lockdown, and I think we were seeing like 2,000-3,000 people logging in online. And obviously, in households, you can multiply that number by 2 or 3. So people were engaging quite a lot. But I think the difficulty comes in looking at the older generations who are maybe not as tech savvy and not as used to having Zoom calls for meetings and speaking to family members and attending services. So on that side, that was interesting. Talking about the Muslim vibe and the work that I've been doing for the last 6 years now, there's always been a view towards the younger generation. So our target audience is kind of the 18 to 35 demographic. Western Muslims specifically is our target. And I don't come from a religiously trained background. I'm a lay person, but my expertise is in digital marketing. So prior to launching the Muslim Vibe, I was running a digital marketing agency with a friend of mine. And we both were very actively involved in the community in, volunteering and putting projects together. And we saw a kind of gap online that there are young people who are very, like everyone said so far, actively engaging online, using social media as a part of their daily life. And the unfortunate reality is that most of the time when you scroll through Instagram timelines and Facebook timelines, there's a lot of very fickle, materialistic kind of throwaway content, if I'm honest. And so we were saying, right, we're going to the mosques to get, and the churches and the synagogues to get our fix of faith, but we can't compartmentalize our faith like that. It's a part of everything that we do. And if we believe that, then it should be a part of social media. It should be, when we're scrolling through, we see something motivational, inspirational. And I think that's what a lot of the, both Chris and Sabah who have spoken are both doing a fantastic job in that space in providing that content. And like their numbers are showing, there is a huge need and an uptake for that. So it kind of just makes sense.
Thank you for that. I'd like to bring in Miranda Threlfall-Holmes now. I'm sure you've seen in the chat, there's been a bit of discussion about a theology of Eucharist online. Perhaps you could respond to that, Miranda, and also your own experience about
it's been a really interesting one, hasn't it? In the very first lockdown, this was hugely controversial in the Church of England. There were articles written about how dreadful it was, and we all got instructions that we weren't allowed under any circumstances to be purporting to be consecrating over the internet. So I've done quite a lot of thinking about this. I've put a link to a short article that I wrote for Modern Church in the comments. But it seems to me that actually what we do online is sacramental. In Christian theology, a sacrament is something very normal and everyday, like bread or water, that both is a sign and a symbol of God's grace, but also really communicates God's grace to us. And it seems to me that that's actually what social media is and can be. And as previous contributors have talked about, it's something really normal and everyday now for most people. And yet it can be a sign of God's grace, and it can really communicate God's grace. People have genuinely found community, been saved from depression, been saved from isolation, being converted to various religions online. It's a real thing. And I have to say, I get quite annoyed by the distinction that we often see in church discourse, sometimes in the media, between kind of real worship, what happens in churches or mosques or whatever, and this kind of online temporary state. Because it seems to me that what we're doing online I think when we first started, in the first few weeks, we were all thinking, oh, this is a little temporary thing to get us over the blip. So we'll stick a camera up and show what we normally do, and it'll keep people going. And increasingly, that's not what I'm thinking. I'm thinking these are two completely separate things. So we're now saying in my parish, when we go back to having worship in our buildings, we're not going to put a camera up in the church and live stream what goes on there. Online church is a different thing that needs a completely different way of engaging with the congregation, with the people there. It's not just broadcasting something real for a different audience. It's not like broadcasting a football match. We're trying to actually create online community. And so with communion, it seems to me that the actual medium is sacramental. And so I don't see why other sacraments can't work. I mean, it's interesting, nobody's been talking about baptism, whether you can become a Christian through this medium. But as Chris referred to at the beginning, for a lot of people, and it's not just young generations, there's been a lot about this in the disability community as well, which I've kind of been tangentially a part of, a sort of honorary member of in some ways over this year, because I've been shielding. Real community is online community.
So would you say that in a sense the pandemic has allowed you to grow your church community?
Yeah, it has. And I would shy away from numbers a bit. I mean, somebody asked in the question, I don't think, I don't count the numbers of people. I'm not talking about thousands of people joining my church. But we have had, individuals in the number, in the kind of 2s and 3s and 4s who have very much joined our church community online and are real members who are now as much known and loved and in relationship with the other members as anyone else. And to me, that is really, really important. And we've kept all the people we had as well, even people who aren't online are dialing in, and we're doing things in other ways as well. But it seems to me that communion works online, because communion isn't about, it's not about some sort of magic. I think a lot of people have quite a superstitious view of it, this kind of magic piece of bread. Communion isn't about that. Communion is about God's action and about gathering as a community around remembering this story of Jesus. Well, you can gather as a community remembering a story as much online as you can in a physical building. And in some ways, the focus is much more on gathering around the story. And I found it really moving in this time, just how much people have searched out religion and faith and community. I don't mean that in a kind of facile way, but there's always been a bit of a debate, particularly in the Church of England, about to what extent do people just come to church out of habit? Is it just habitual? And it's been really quite moving in this time to see that I'd say virtually everybody in my congregation has been really trying, getting grandchildren to buy them a tablet so that they can come online, or working out a quite complex online conference call system so that they can still engage. This is not habitual. People are having to make an effort.
Well, thank you. And I think that's fascinating reflection and answers. Can I now bring in Pete Phillips from Durham University, maybe to give us some facts and figures about what is happening in terms of digital church? I see you put in the chat box, both physical and digital church are real church. Could you tell us a bit more about your work and research?
Yes, we've been kind of looking at the whole aspect of digital church and what digital church means, but also about this concept of hybrid church. We don't want to say, we have to switch everything over to digital. What we want to do is see how we can have both physical and digital church working together in some form of hybridity. Some people, of course, have been doing online religion for years and years and years. It's not something new, though the church was forced to come online in March 2020, the disabled community, long-term ill community, and so on, have been there for ages. People have been talking about online religion for decades. Tim Hutchings is online, who's an ethnographer of that history. So we're kind of Johnny come latelys to this, and we're having to catch up the game and perhaps learn from the disabled church about how to do online religion and how to engage in sacraments online. So it's got so much to learn. I know Josh Edelman's on from the British Ritual Online project up at MMU as well, and we're talking offline as well. So another research project there exploring how ritual happens both in digital, in this experience here, where we are real to one another. I'm not an avatar, I'm a real person, and all the people watching this are real people, yeah, flesh and blood people, engaged in conversation together, as though we were in the same room together, as though we were. It is okay. It's an analog, but it's okay. And I think that it's really, really important to kind of push that across, to say that religion can be this thing that we kind of flip from both in-person expression and also off. I think actually that Judaism and Islam have done much better during the lockdown, because prayer starts at home, prayer starts in the family, and there has been this kind of sense that Islam and Judaism have been able to hold on to that spirituality, whereas we've had the arguments about churches being locked down and legal moves to open them up and so on. But of course, the other thing to say is the church hasn't closed. The church buildings have closed, but the church has been deployed into people's houses. The numbers are huge. We did some work with Savanta Comres, and they told us that this figure between 24 and 28% of people were engaging with online worship regularly. Of those, young adults, up to 48% were engaging with online worship or an online organized devotional act, is what we said. So the figures there, you kind of have a normal attendance in physical church of about 4 million a Sunday. But online, there's the potential of 15.6 million people in the UK online. And that's an opinion poll. It's not people counting, views on YouTube. It's a polling group where people have offered their own experience. And they're hardly likely to kind of bump up and say, oh, it's aspirational, because which amongst young adults do you know are aspiring to come to church? It's actually kind of very, very old fashioned and non-popular thing to do. And yet there's still 48% of those young adults under 35 are saying that they've engaged in online worship. That's
amazing statistics. Could I, going back to the question of online Eucharist and online services, I'd like to ask Christopher Jamison, I think, on the call, about how this relates, say, within the Catholic Church and of course across the churches, in terms of the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. How would an online Eucharist work? Should you bring your own bread? How would you say this should? What would be the theology behind this?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Miranda, for your very good explanation of how you're doing the Eucharist, whatever. But I noted as well that you began by saying that you'd been forbidden to do consecration of bread and wine across the internet. I think we've got to be honest here, that the Catholic theology, and that's using that term both within the Anglican and the Roman Catholic, the Catholic theology of the Eucharist is that the Eucharist is about the body of Christ. Now, the real presence of the body of Christ, we can argue about the mechanism. I personally favor the report of an Anglican Roman Catholic group who put a footnote that said transubstantiation is one possible way of explaining this. So I'm not wedded to that. But I think that there is a question that somehow the real presence of the body of Christ requires real bodies. And I think I'm not suggesting that your approach is wrong. I'm just saying that classic Catholic theology is seriously challenged by what you're saying. And given the pretty conservative nature of Catholic leadership, certainly in Europe, I'm just, with the possible exception of the Pope himself, I'm just wondering how we can, taking Pete Phillips's point, which I take very, very seriously, that the online thing is here to stay and has much greater potential than the personal presence model. And I absolutely accept that. I think there was a real challenge, though, to the classic theology of the Eucharist there. I sent a little note in the chat box too to Saba and Salim, asking a question that intrigues me, because I think there may be something to share here, is what is the motivation for Muslims to come to the mosque rather than to pray at home? Because to an ignorant Christian, when I see Muslims I know who pray 5 times a day and choose to do it wherever they are, in the office, in the airport, or wherever, they seem to be able to do it just there, just as Christians can do it there. But there is a particular motivation for Christians to go to church Sunday, which comes from this notion of the body of Christ. What is the Muslim theology that draws people to the mosque, especially on Friday? Because I'd really like to understand that. In other words, I'm searching for new insights about what draws people to the physical church, because I think that that's going to be complementary to a new emphasis on online. Is that making sense? That as the one grows, the other will be challenged. So as online grows, the physical presence will be challenged, and therefore the physical presence church needs to renew its theology. And I'm intrigued to see how that might happen.
Okay, well, if Salim and Saba could answer that, and then we go to Miranda to answer the other point, if that's okay.
I'll just summarize. I replied to the question when you had written it down in the chat box, but basically I'm not a religious expert, as I said, but from my perspective, my understanding is that there's a lot of emphasis placed on congregational prayer over praying individually. So whilst you can pray your 5 daily prayers on your own, it's always better, even in the office, for example, if there's another Muslim there, to pray together. And so there's always been that kind of pull and attraction towards congregating. And I think especially culturally, in the sort of back home countries, if I can say, there is this thing. My grandfather, for example, in Mombasa, in Kenya, prays every day, all his prayers in the mosque, and he walks there and all his friends are there, and it's like a very social thing. And the social element is key, I think, to that. I believe personally that religiously why it's so encouraged is for the social element. Like we've all talked about, religion has that, fulfills that social need that's very important. And we've seen with COVID how difficult it's been without that. But I think Saba might be able to give a better answer than myself.
That is such an amazing answer. Just to add to that, I think whatever house of worship it is, you go to that place to literally cut yourself off from the world and go for that connection and union with your maker, because you're going for that sole purpose. That is the essence of going to the mosque and praying in congregation. Secondly, is the social aspect, that you gave your example of your grandfather. My dad is a police officer in Manchester. He's retiring soon. He's adamant to get a house or a flat near the mosque, so he can literally walk to the mosque and pray 5 times a day. And it is massively a social aspect, because when you go and meet someone, it can give you positive mental health. You're able to talk to someone, you're praying together, the energy is there together. If you've got a problem or an issue, you can discuss it with a fellow Muslim in the mosque. So the social aspect is huge, but also praying congregation, especially in the mosque, you're going for that sole purpose, cutting yourself off from the world, so you can give your undivided attention, which is needed during prayer. And I think that's just the second part of the fantastic answer which Salim gave.
Well, thank you. And Miranda Threlfall Holmes, you want to come back on the question around the real presence?
Well, yeah, I mean, I find this really fascinating, and I'm not saying I've come to the answer yet, but I think Christopher's absolutely right to say it's a real challenge to traditional Eucharistic theology. And I wonder if to some extent it's a bit like a kind of Reformation analogy, that this is taking something, the Reformation kind of took the Bible out of the church's control and said, actually, let's translate this into people's language. And of course, that wasn't just the Reformation, there's a lot of history around that. Let's not be simplistic about it. But in a way where there's something about going online that is taking communion out of the church hierarchy's control and putting it into the hands of people. And I think that's why it has been so controversial. It's interesting, of course, Pete's made the comment in the chat that this is something that all sorts of other free churches have been doing for a very long time. Now, I mean, there isn't a suggestion that I've seen in the Church of England of a kind of lay presidency. I think a lot of the fear around communion online is around lay presidency at home. That I don't think is what I've experienced or what people that I'm aware of doing are thinking of what is going on. And we're not saying that we are doing communion online and people are consecrating online, or I'm consecrating what's happening at home. Because that's something that our church has been very clear that we're not meant to do. What we're talking about is I'm presiding and consecrating and sharing communion with my family, and people are joining in. But what I've said from the very beginning, and initially this wasn't particularly thought through, is, you know, if people are watching at home, if they've got something to eat or drink at that point, it functions as a sign of our community and the fact that we are still gathered around a common, not table, but screen. We're still gathered around those stories, and we're still doing something live together. And it's been quite important that we're doing that live and sharing in that moment. But I think Chris was actually absolutely right. It is really challenging to our Eucharistic theology, which for me is one of the really exciting things about it. But I would want to come back on saying, you know, it's about real bodies, because as Pete said, we are real. This is my real body. You know? This is not a bit. It's not like, you know, what was it, years ago? Ship of Fools experimented, didn't they, with the kind of church, and you see churches in Minecraft and churches in Second Life. This is different to that, because this is us interacting as ourselves live with other real people. It's slightly different, I think, from doing the same thing in Second Life or in Minecraft or on whatever other computer programs my children spend all their lives on.
Can I ask Chris Lee, do you think from your engagement with social media, there are people, there's audiences out there who, let's say, would listen to your 60-second sermon, or they would engage with your online content, and then over time would be wanting to be part of a communion service online? Is that how you see things developing?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I've seen that, and people have found me online and said that I've helped them come back to belief in God, and they found their church. And, you know, certainly there's massive fruit. You know a tree by its fruit. So there is huge fruit online, and I have seen people more engaged with faith and being open to faith because they've been warmed and they've been pulled in. And, you know, be a Christian, I believe in the Holy Spirit working, and that doesn't, you know, there's examples biblically where Christ is present talking to someone, and the Spirit is moved someone somewhere else. And so we don't believe that because I'm online, the Spirit can't reach or work in someone's life, even though we're distant. So I do believe in the working of the Spirit through online mediums. I think there's a nuance between, and Miranda did touch on this, the difference between live and recorded, because I think there you're getting into something more difficult. So for instance, if I did a Eucharist live and then it went online, and then later on someone watched it, and did they then have communion? They did the bread and the wine, but it was from a recording. That is a stretch, and that is a difficult understanding. It's kind of like, you know, I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, where they have that. This is not live now. You cannot ring this number and don't vote because it's been done. And there's something comical that points to something true there. But I think there is a lot of thinking that it is being stretched and challenged. And, you know, I opened a bit of a kettle of fish with this whole idea of throwing communion in there, but it is something that gets us all thinking. And I think that is really exciting. And, you know, my understanding of Christ's presence in the world is we get to name that when we're doing the Eucharist. And I believe in a sacramental real presence in the communion. But I think as a priest, when I'm doing the prayers, I'm calling out what is true already there. So I think you can do that online. And in a sense, I have done it online. So maybe the church will tell me off, but I've done it and doing it.
Okay. Pete Phillips, do you have something to add about online communion?
Yeah, I just want to kind of say something about this, because I think online communion is the hidden problem about digital church and kind of a hidden issue over COVID, during COVID. the major churches all adopted spiritual communion as the model. This is the idea that vicars can break bread and wine in their homes and what have you, and partake of that themselves. But the laity are left with this kind of prayer version of that. And yes, God is in that prayer. God can provide sustenance for the people. But I do have a kind of worry about that theology, because it says, you know, the priests can take bread and wine, but the people have to cope with prayer, you know, have to cope with, you know, the lack of bread and wine. And I do wonder whether, you know, we've actually dealt with our people properly. I'm a Methodist, and you know, I am fervently in the belief that God can consecrate bread and wine across the internet, and that we should be having online communion. But the Methodist Church doesn't agree with that, and I'm under discipline not to do bread and wine, not to do communion online. But I worry about all the Methodist people who've died of COVID without having the means of grace, the most important means of grace, of sharing bread and wine together. And I do wonder whether we've sold our people short by not making the theological jump, as we've done with preaching, as we've done with the Bible, as we've done with worship. Yet at this point, we've held off and said, no, we can't do it. And I think that's a bad decision.
Okay, some questions in the chat box. There's a question from Jeremy Simmons about if anyone has any thoughts around inclusivity of online community worship, particularly those with sensory disability, also interested in people experiencing mental health challenges. What have been some of the advantages, barriers? Could I bring in Joshua Edelman now, who's been working on a project at Manchester University about digital worship during COVID? Joshua, could you perhaps respond to that question and maybe give your own thoughts on what you've heard so far? Any insights?
Sure. My bosses will be unhappy if I don't correct you. It's Manchester Metropolitan University.
Manchester Metropolitan. Apologies.
Right, no worries. It's fine. The interesting thing about access is that I think online worship both opens up access and closes down access to different groups. Different kinds of sensory issues are a thing. We've talked about age, the very young, the very old. Some of them are actually, you know, the under 5 set can engage with religion in a sense a lot easier online than they could in the building. Sometimes it's useful to have a snack there. But this is an ongoing issue that I think a lot of religious leaders across the country and across the world are dealing with in creative ways. Our project at Manchester Met is called British Ritual Innovation under COVID-19. We're looking in an interfaith way at the ways British ritual leaders are adapting their forms of worship to the situation. And especially we're looking not just at kind of weekly worship, but we're also looking at festival celebrations, holidays, as well as life cycle events like weddings and funerals. In particular, we're doing quite a lot with funerals because it's a real need. And what we're really trying to figure out is exactly how these adaptations work. How do you maintain that sense that this is an authentic, real ritual that does the work that a ritual is supposed to do and gives you that sense of community, gives you that sense of being part of being in a sacred space with your fellow co-religions, and yet is available. What is the lines? Different people are drawing different lines about how much adaptation becomes innovation, which is a problem, or how much adaptation is just making accessible. And then even with that, does it feel different? Does it work differently? We're doing a lot of interviews, surveys, and that kind of thing. So I don't have a lot of results yet, but thus far, I can tell you most people have found themselves more welcomed than before. And one of the things that definitely has been part of that is that things seems to be more regular. A lot of churches and other groups are doing daily worship that they never would have done in person. And I think it was Saba who said, you know, our attention spans are getting shorter. There's a thing about that. I think daily prayer, which is not necessarily a thing for all groups, is becoming more of a thing. Just a little bit every day, boom, 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 boom. And that's been really sustaining for a lot of people.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to now ask each of our panel to respond to I think what's going to have to be the final question, but I'd like to bring it back to a practical, concrete challenge. What does the growth in online community, online worshiping community, what is that going to mean for the church buildings and the practical organizational structures of the church? Because clearly there's a massive challenge here. I know it's a big topic, probably a topic for another webinar, but how do you see that? Surely we need smaller churches and smaller mosques, because if you've got massive online communities, what needs to happen practically for places of worship, given the huge growth in online community, which in many ways is expanding your bases, but without outside of the physical space? So let's start with Chris, and then we'll go through.
I wanted to hear what everyone else was going to say first, but
Right.
I throw my thought in. I think I don't think church buildings will be replaced. I think church buildings, probably similar to mosques, are more than just a place of worship for people. They are a place of gathering. They also have places for the local community to use. So I think there will be church spaces always available, but I do think that there will be more. The church has to be more able to articulate itself and be accessible online. And I think it's the key for me is accessibility. The younger generation and the people today, with Google and everything else, it's immediate information, immediate questions with immediate answers. The immediacy is what we need to be doing. And, you know, the great missionaries of the past, you know, thinking of Jesuits, they all took on an aspect of the culture, and through that culture spoke the life of Christ. And I think that we are in a new age where digital technology, the internet and media is this new part of culture. And as the church, we need to be taking on that model and speaking life into those mediums. And I think so I think we need to be more porous, more available online, resources online, and the thinking of what that means for, you know, my parish. I think parish structures will probably in the next few years maybe disperse into a new ways of thinking. But yeah, that's just a quick thought.
Thank you. Salim?
I think it's quite an interesting time, and specifically looking at the online versus physical space. So I mentioned that I was previously on the committee. I'm no longer a trustee, but my dad's actually the secretary of the mosque now, and we were discussing this the other day. And I think there is a fear that younger people will not go to the physical spaces as much, and I think that's a very legitimate fear, because there is a comfort, and you know, being a digital native, we know how to kind of operate online. But I think that's where it's going to be very interesting to see how the physical spaces pivot in the future. There needs to be more of an understanding, and I think Chris mentioned it right at the beginning. I can't remember the terms that he used, but it was about having a sort of forum, a clubhouse. I think what was the term? A club versus, I'm butchering it now, Chris, I apologize.
Club and classroom, the idea of club being gathering together.
Exactly. So I think what we're learning now with the pandemic is that the classroom doesn't exist anymore, and a lot of the online worship and things that are happening is now more club-based. And so if we are going to get back into the physical spaces, there needs to be that appreciation that we can't just have the classroom approach, and there needs to be that more community vibe in the physical and the stuff that we're doing. I think it's provided, yes, a challenge for churches and mosques and synagogues and every other faith group, but it's a very good challenge to have, because when, hopefully, God willing, things go back to normal, we're still going to have all the experiences that we've had over the last year and a bit. And so actually understanding how we move forward, and hopefully I hope that we don't just go back to how things were, because I think all faith groups and leaders will acknowledge and appreciate that there are gaps in how we serve people. And so this has actually shone a light on that, and hopefully we can kind of uplift and do better things. That's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think because congregational prayer is so important within Islam, and also adding the fact that you can't actually offer the 5 daily prayers in congregation over Zoom, so you have to be there in person. So bearing that in mind, I think mosques will always still be the base of prayer and worship, and attend where possible, and when the mosques reopen and house of worship open again. But I think social media will be a massive and integral part of moving forward. Because I still think people will be very, very cautious in how they do meet people and whatever. Maybe classes might start taking place online just because it's convenient. But I think it's a very good challenge, as Salim mentioned, of how we're going to move forward. And I think also bearing in mind how we need to engage the youth in trying to bring them to physical worship in houses of worship, because you just can't replicate that virtually. So I think mosques will definitely still be a base.
And Miranda, what do you think? Is it church buildings shrinking, or?
Well, I'd like to give it. I think I come at this from quite a historical perspective. I was a historian before I was ordained, and it seems to me that for most of human history, the domestic space has been the centre of everything. It's been where production has happened. It's been where learning has happened. It's been where faith has happened. And it, particularly post-industrial revolution, we had this outsourcing suddenly to different professionalized segregated spaces. So education starts happening in schools very much. Medicine goes to hospitals, and people who are dying go to hospitals and care homes. Work goes out to factories and workplaces. And in a way, I wonder whether this pandemic has suddenly shifted the tide on that, taking things back to primarily a domestic space with everything happening in it. And obviously there are issues there with work-life boundaries, but it could be a much more human scale way to live. Now, in that historical context, if you look back over the last kind of 2,000 years, obviously there have always been big church spaces, but they haven't functioned as the place that religion happens. That mainly happens at home. Big church spaces have functioned as kind of deliberately extravagant, empty spaces that remind us of the importance of God. That say, we're going to take some space and some stone and some jewels and some precious metal and say, actually, God is so important that we're going to reserve, a central part of our city for this. And so I wonder whether religious spaces in general, sacred space, begin to go back to that kind of primarily symbolic state where we'll do big occasional gatherings and so on, but they're not where majority of religion happens, which I think is great. But of course, there are financial implications to that, because they were always funded historically by a kind of rich elite, not by the people who went there. They weren't those kind of spaces. And in a way, we're trying to do that model now on a financial model that wasn't designed for that. So I think that is going to have to change.
And finally, Pete, do you agree? Is it church at home now for the future?
No, I think it's both, and I think it's really, really important to kind of do that. So I think just as Joshua was saying in the chat about the domestication of religion, I think that's really good. We've privatized religion into church, and I think some of the kind of desperate moves that we've said, we need bums on pews, is the wrong way to go. We want actually people to be Christians, 7 days a week. That it's part of who we are, and we do want that for all religions. We want people to be Muslims and Jews and Hindus their whole lives, every single part of them to be influenced by this faith. And so I think that you'll probably have more worship going back into physical churches on a Sunday, and then all the kind of what we call in Christianity discipleship, Bible studies, prayer groups, prayer meetings, and so on, even business meetings, switching over to Zoom, because it just makes sense, because there will be fewer church buildings around you. There's a Twitter stream this morning on will your church survive? Because of cost and the lack of the problems that churches are already having before COVID, and COVID has just added to those problems for many rural churches. So will churches survive in the number? Probably not. Therefore, there'll be further to travel for them and so on. But public worship on a Sunday probably will be the norm, with some online element for those who are still unhappy to come along. But online for discipleship and midweek activities as the main place where people learn their faith day by day.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of the hour. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this fascinating discussion, and to all our panel. Thank you for all your insights. I think we've learned a lot, and a lot of debate about online Eucharist, the theological implications of digital, but clearly we're in a new moment, and in perhaps a new moment of history, which is going to be change things fundamentally as we go through the rest of this dreadful pandemic, and try and come out the other side. So thank you very much, everyone, for being part of this discussion. We will have next week, the Religion Media Centre have another Zoom briefing. Information on that will be sent out very soon. If you'd like to keep in touch, please email, and so we can add you to the invite list. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you.